West is not as kind of these tectonic plates which are some sort of colliding with each other, but really an abbreviation for complex heterogeneous entities which are being policed and with very fuzzy boundaries. And those boundaries, and drawing on those boundaries, is what creates the conflict. And in this current situation, the conflict is being created for particular reasons, that there is a tension that people do feel in terms of Islam and the West.
So you don't think it necessarily has been fired by the long fuse over the last 900 years? I'm exaggerating and simplifying just
sure.
Because this is a conversation, but you don't see that. You see it as something much more inflamed by the last 30, 40, 50 years.
I'd say probably the last 100 years or so, I mean, last 70 years. I think that isn't to deny that historical thing that Hamza was talking about. I think that exists. But it's a bit like saying that, for example, what happens when Germany and England play football, suddenly memories of the Second World War are evoked. And between that doesn't mean that constantly, you know, Germany and England are always, in conflict with each other. I mean, previous to the First World War, the royal family in Germany and Britain were actually quite close in many ways. So it seems to me what we're seeing is how memories are being used to give depth to conflict rather than the actual historical record, which is actually very mixed.
William Dalrymple, what do you see as the source of the tension? And could, as Hamza brought in the historical perspective, we can bring in the idea, the notion, the fact that for several hundred years the Islamic scholars took over Hellenistic learning, they transferred it to the West. Without those 600 or 700 years, the Western Renaissance would not have been possible. They carried through and improved on and refined and changed algebra, mathematics, astronomy, all sorts of medicine, and so on and so forth. So you very much see an intertwined population, with a great vision of Cordoba with Jews, Christians and Muslims learning together in this great city of the Middle Ages. So in one sense you could say, well, this is strange. They were doing okay with each other.
I think you can easily overemphasize the crusader, the conflictual element in the relationship between Islam and Christianity. Certainly it was there. But there have been so many periods when the two have come together peacefully. And in many of the great periods of the most sublime literature, the most technological sophistication have happened in those points of contact. In Islamic Spain, you mentioned, Islamic Sicily. And it's a two-way process, too. I think it's very important to remember Islam's debt to Christianity. Islam grew up in what was then a Christian Near East. And a lot of the very basic conventions of Islam come from Christianity. Ramadan, which at first seems a very alien, Islamic, foreign practice, is in fact nothing more than the Islamicization of Lent. If you see how Eastern Christians fast during Lent, they do the all-day sunrise to sunset, of not touching food or drink. The Islamic way of praying with its prostrations is very, very close to the pre-Islamic Syrian Orthodox way, which if you go today to Eastern Turkey, you see them bowing and prostrating in pewless churches that look exactly like mosques. And this goes on and over and over again. Minarets, the first minarets, are square church towers in Syria. So it isn't just a situation of conflict, and it isn't just a one-way stream from Islam to the West. It's a very deep and intertwined relationship. The only thing I ever learnt about Islam at school, even though I did both theology and history, was the Crusades. That was the only time I ever came into contact with it. And I think it's very important to see that this is a very complex and very intertwined relationship.
Jonathan Friedland, can I come to you now to answer the same question, really? Where do you see the causes and the sources of the clash? What historical roots do you find, if you find any?
Well, I think they are there, but I feel about this whole relationship that there's something sort of unrequited about it. There's something imbalanced about it, and it relates to something that William was saying about the absence of Islam from his own schooling and from mine as well. And something Hamza was saying too about how the Islamic world seems more aware of history than people in the West. And maybe the result is that what you get is this sense that from we're hearing across the Arab and Muslim world now a sense of clash or conflict with the West, that the West is against it, which has a whole lot of historical evocations, just as you were saying, that can be stirred up, either going back 900 years in the Crusades, a few hundred years ago to the turn back of the Ottoman Empire outside the gates of Vienna, or the last century of colonialism. So they can feel as if there is a series here, a pattern here, a historical tension between West and Islam, whereas I feel on the Western side, actually, there's nothing like that, partly because of ignorance. People just haven't thought about Islam that much. They're not really that aware of these centuries of history. And in an odd way, you'd think, well, maybe perhaps that's a benign thing. In a funny way, that's almost part of the problem, because there's a lack of respect contained in that, because it doesn't even regard Islam as this sort of equal enemy, let alone as an equal. And so there's something, I feel, of surprise in the way the West has reacted to this. What have you got against us? And you hear it in both President Bush and Tony Blair when they say Islam's a peaceful religion, we don't have any grievance against it, not thinking, well, how does it look at the other end of the telescope? So there's something of the unrequited, not exactly love affair between these two.
It's a really good point, because I think, I don't think people understand the extent of humiliation that the Muslim world has been. And in fact, Osama bin Laden mentioned that. We've been living in humiliation for 80 years. And I think the aggression of the Nazi Germany was a result of the humiliation that had occurred after World War I, the Versailles Treaty, the humiliation of the German people. I think it's, in a sense, a testimony to the patience of the Muslim nations that they really have felt this incredible humiliation. Another aspect of it is that the Muslims were a very successful religion. Islam was an imperial force almost right from the start. The Muslims are not comfortable with being objects. They've been subjects of history throughout the vast majority of Islamic history. And I would like to add one other thing about the fact that we are post-Christian in our worldview. Generally, the cosmology of the West is secular humanist. And I think that while Muslims see a crusade, it's not so much a religious crusade, it's more of a commercial crusade. Because I think instead of sending missionaries now, the West tends to send McDonald's executives to set up accounts in the Muslim world. So
can I come to you, Salman, now, just to maybe draw, perhaps to a close, the longer historical perspective, though. After the Enlightenment, 18th century Enlightenment, again, this is broad, Western society became notably more secular, science, the idea of progress, and revolutions had taken place, a political revolution towards democracy, the industrial revolution, the religious revolution towards each man can seek his God in his own way, intellectual revolution, Darwin turned the world upside down, that sort of thing. Is there a feeling that Islam did not, having been, as it were, equal, I'm sorry about the simplicity of this, in about 1700, 1750, is there a sense in which by not participating in that, there was something of what Jonathan was saying, somehow they dropped out of the picture?
I think one of the things you've got to remember is this, that when the Enlightenment took place, and when you talk about all of this kind of major transformation which Europe undertook to industrialization, to this kind of modernized society that we more or less understand now, there weren't many people, not just among Muslims, but Chinese, Indians, who actually took it seriously in the first instance. I mean, you've got so many kind of accounts of these clockworks and gadgets being sent to these courts of the Chinese emperor and then sending them back. What use are they to us? So the first thing is that it wasn't that obvious that something major had happened. Secondly, and what happened is this, once it became very clear that this technical revolution had really changed the relationship of power in the world within Europe, I think Europeans came to worry about how to explain this. And like most successful people, you tend to see this in terms of your own virtues. So the quest for the European miracle now turned upon what was it so specific about Europe? Was it found in its culture? Was it found in its geology? I mean, all of these accounts have been written which are trying to explain this transformation. And in the end, what the effect of these stories have been is to exclude the possibility of anyone else imitating it, because the idea was that what happened in Europe was due to the unique circumstances of Europeanness, and the only way that people could do this is by actually imitating Europeanness. And that in itself already set up a frontier between what people had to decide. So to be modern, you had to become European eventually. And that's why, for example, you have Mustafa Kemal introducing an act banning the wearing of the fez. Somehow there's a relationship with the headgear that you wear in iron and steel production. Now obviously it sounds absurd to us, but this is seriously believed, that somehow if you don't imitate Europeanness, whatever that may mean, it's a very complicated term, you will not be able to achieve whatever Europe has achieved.
What you're hearing there, I think, is the roots of what is a current problem there seemed to be only one model of modernization in the world, that to be in the 21st century was to globalize, to get McDonald's and Nike and the rest of it. And so you have globalization seem to mean only Americanization. And when people say now, for example, oh no, there could be an Islamic model of capitalism, democracy, etc., people think that's either a joke or they think there's just a blank space there, because no one is yet used to, and maybe the roots of it are what Salman's saying, an alternative non-Western, non-American model of modernization.
Well, I'd like to just come to the end of this part with Hamza Yusuf. Is there something in the notion of modernization that seems to be incompatible with Islam, or is that just a way we're reading it?
I think what happens is modernization in the Muslim world is interpreted as westernization. And that's where you get a serious conflict. Islam, in no means, I think, has a problem with the achievements of human beings. However, I think that in some ways, in the West, achievements have been seen in this scientific milieu of progress, in a sense, abandoning religion. I think a lot of our scientists see it as that we're moving into a stage beyond religion, whereas for the Muslims, science and religion, in a sense, science is constrained by religion. And so it sees that there's a real humanistic impulse in Muslims to make sure that science is to benefit humanity.
Is there a sense in which we have got, as Jonathan said earlier in the discussion actually, we think we're sending out one message where another is going out. We think the West is sending out a message of freedom, equality, democracy, fine living, women's rights and so on. And in fact, what is being received is decadence, mere consumerism.
Propping up horrible regimes.
Yeah. Propping up horrible regimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something we may well get onto, but the experience of globalization or modernization in Arab and Muslim countries is not how we might imagine it could be. I mean, the writer Farid Zakaria has talked about a globalization you can see, but you can't touch, meaning that what you have is, yes, the exploitation and the sweatshops and the McDonald's, perhaps, but you don't have the rule by law, perhaps freedom of expression, multi-party democracies. You don't have the things that we regard as basic, and so what you see is, yes, there's corrupting influences, the things that many of us regard as the price, the downside of our own liberties and modern freedoms. They seem to be, it seems to me, having some of the price and none of the benefits.
I think it's even more sort of extreme than that. I think one of the effects of colonialism demonstrated that you could have liberal democracy at home and tyranny abroad. I mean, the colonial empires were most of the times at the same time where you had certain kind of democratization in Europe, in societies. So the fact that you can have this, idea of democracy and then have tyranny abroad is something that isn't inexplicable for most people in the Muslim world.
Muslims have really, I think that's a really important point that Salman's making. One of the signs that I saw several times in Pakistani things, human rights for you and tyranny for us. And that is a definite feeling in the Muslim world, is that there's a type of hypocrisy or double standard that the West plays. On the one hand, it espouses all of these wonderful Enlightenment ideas, which are in fact, more often than not, very compatible with traditional Islamic understanding. They really are, if people understand the Islamic tradition.
We've got to take a break for a couple of minutes, and we're back to continue this discussion. Hello, in part two, we'll look at the internal dynamic of Islam. I'll start again with you, Hamza. You said that Islam was hijacked on September the 11th on that plane as an innocent victim. So do you think it's a mistake to associate this attack with Islam?
I think that what I really meant by that is what happens when religion is used in the West for extremist purposes. For instance, even in Japan with the Buddhist sect that use sarin gas, I think nobody in the West, because there's a general knowledge that Buddhism is a pacifist religion, nobody associated that with Buddhists. They just saw it as a freak incident. I think the same is true in America. There are terrorist activities done by extremist Christians, abortion clinics that are bombed, things like that. Nobody in the West associates those with Christianity because they know that generally Christianity does not teach that. Whereas unfortunately, because there's such profoundly deep misconceptions about Islam, when these events do occur, many people in the West do in fact regard these events to be somehow intrinsic to the Islamic militant.
But there is an explanation for that, which is that you're right about the abortion clinic case, but if then the streets of Christian countries were filled with demonstrators wielding placards saying, we support the person person who organised this, he's our hero, he's our champion, bearing his face on placards, people would then think, oh, I see, there is some read across from the motives of these people to the wider Christian world. You'd begin to think there's a link. Equally, if those Christians who destroyed the abortion clinics were not denounced by Christianity's leading clerics, who did not say, this is nothing to do with us, who did not gather in some formal convocation to formally ostracize the perpetrators of that, then you'd begin to think maybe there's some link. And my worry about the Islamic world is that, firstly, I know there have been absolutely individual senior clerics who have denounced September the 11th, but the fact that there has not been that formal move to gather in convocation, to gather collectively, to ostracize Osama bin Laden, say this is nothing to do with what we're about. You've done it a bit in what you've written, but others, it seems to me, have not done it in that collective way. Inevitably, people are going to think, and most importantly, the millions of people who seem to be supporting it across the Muslim world, for all the reasons we've been talking about, those two things combine to make non-Muslims, who admittedly know all too little about Islam, think maybe there's something Islamic about this rather than just a rogue one-off element.
But I think the media I think the media has some responsibility here, because the media puts a magnifying glass. If you look at Pakistan, a rally of 15,000 people, we could get a rally of the National Front in this country that would have some very extremist views. The same in America. I mean, we could get some very extremist views. If the media shed its light on those groups as somehow being representative of the West, I think people would be horrified in the West. I really think the overwhelming majority of Muslims were as horrified as anybody else, and in some ways more so, because their religion was associated with this. So I can't agree with you.
I just think Jonathan, come back.
It's just the thing that, and again I say it as not as a more in sorrow than in anger. I mean, it is something that worries me, because there is that polling, for example, in Pakistan. I too wanted to believe the TV cameras have gone for the handful of people and magnified it. But there's polling that shows 80+% support for Osama bin Laden. Not actually, you're right, for the specific action of September the 11th.
They don't, I would say, first of all, that most people in the non-Arab world, they don't understand. He speaks in Arabic. They don't know really what he's saying. They see him, he's a very romantic character. He's wearing the traditional garb of righteousness and piety. They see him as a man who gave up $300 million to live in a cave, to sacrifice for righteous cause. He was seen as a freedom fighter by the Reagan administration back in the 80s, and he was a hero in Saudi Arabia for doing what he did in repelling the evil empire from Afghanistan. So I think people have a hard time dealing with the fact that somebody could go down the wrong path.
What about that formal denunciation, though, that kind of...
I think there has been. I really do, and I think that it's unfair to say that there hasn't been. There has been a formal denunciation. I think, unfortunately, there is elements within the Muslim world. I'll give you an example. A Saudi Arabian friend of mine said that he was asked by somebody, what was the initial reaction? And he said the initial reaction was, in a sense, some people had this initial reaction of, you know, yes, this is a good thing. And he said, but when the contorted faces of the victims came, it came home to them. It wasn't a video game. It wasn't a film. It was something very profoundly horrifying. And I think that they were shocked. So there is, unfortunately, in the Muslim world, there is a sense that they're at the brunt of misguided foreign policies. There is a lot of aggression towards America. I'm not going to deny that.
I think theologically it's quite clear that anyone that tries to use Islam to commit terrorist acts is entering the field of heresy. The Quranic injunctions against the Quranic injunctions for the conduct of any sort of aggression or war are very, very clear. There must never be any non-combatants killed. War must be declared. Women and children must be protected. And this is, I mean, is far, far more clearly expressed in the Quran than it ever is in either the Jewish or the Christian scriptures. And so to try and use Islam as and the Quran as a legitimizer of terrorist acts is simply heresy. I mean, Hamza knows this better than I do.
Absolutely.
But I think you're missing the point here. I don't think the issue is theological. The issue is political. And all of this debate is predicated on the notion that we know what terrorism is. Most Muslims would actually argue, the first point, well, what actually constitutes terrorism? Is terrorism simply a euphemism for what the United States or its allies do not like, political violence they do not like? or is it actually something more substantive? And that's the first argument, that whenever you actually put this point to them, the first thing they come up with is a series of, well, what about? The 500,000 people who are dying in Iraq because of the sanctions regimes, the fact there's daily bombing in Iraq. What about all the Palestine? What about Kashmir? I mean, you could go through this very long list. So the question is this about terrorism? Then what is the definition of terrorism? And this is where I think we really reach a point here. Is there actually agreed definition of terrorism which transcends simply the United States and its allies? And these allies also include the governments and the senior ulama to some extent. That's why you don't get these kind of idea of holding a convocation where everyone will come together and denounce it. It won't make any difference because Muslim people are not stupid necessarily. In a sense, they realize that these governments speak for themselves, or they are actually, many of these governments are heavily implicated. And just because a fatwa is issued by somebody, it doesn't necessarily speak to that experience. Now, the people in Pakistan who are protesting, they know that 2 years ago when Musharraf came to power, both Tony Blair and Bill Clinton were demanding return to democracy. But they now think that it's very unlikely that Tony Blair or George Bush are asking Musharraf to have a democratic election right now at this moment. Now, that's not stupidity, it seems to me. I think it's quite clear why they know that. And I think we tend to overestimate this kind of, because, you know, these people don't have the kind of privileges of the education of the first world, etc., that these people don't know anything. They actually do know it because they live at the sharp end of it.
I understand all that, and I think you can hold simultaneously in your head an awareness of the suffering at the hands of American foreign policy, etc., of the vast swathes of the Muslim world, and believe that it's a pretty clear case of terrorism when a building with 6,000 people in it gets hit with a view to everyone in it dying. And what I suppose, in a way, I was looking for was, if there was somebody who had done that or ordered that in the name of Judaism, my guess is that the Jewish world would gather to denounce that person for the reason Hamza says, which is, don't steal our religion and abuse it in this way. Similarly, I would hope in the Christian world there'd be a similar reaction.
Barak Goldstein is considered a hero among some extremists.
Against some, absolutely, amongst some extremists, but formally by the rest of the rabbinic establishment, he's been denounced.
But every
that's what I'm saying about the
Muslim
Muslims.
countries condemned these bombings.
Absolutely.
I mean,
it's
Iraq,
only
I think, is the only one.
extremists.
Well, you use the word, the fatwa. Why, for example, can there not be a fatwa against Osama bin Laden? Would that
No,
not
there
say...
has been.
Hundreds of
No, there have been
fatwas. That doesn't
hundreds of
make any
fatwas.
difference.
A formal fatwa against Osama bin Laden?
There'll be hundreds of fatwas
Yusuf
against.
al-Qaradawi, who's one of the most respected amongst particularly younger people, came out. Many of the scholars have denounced. Absolutely. Al-Azhar, which is considered very representative of the scholastic tradition in Islam, came out with complete condemnation, fatwas. Nobody has justified this theologically. I think, unfortunately, there has been emotional justification for it, which shouldn't be seen as intellectual or theological.
But I think the important point to remember here is this, that when we're dealing with world politics, the exercise of great power isn't just the ability to use force. It's actually to make that force look just and legitimate. And that is one of the kind of questions that, you know, the United States keeps running into. This war against terrorism, the first victims of the events after the 11th of September were Muslims or Sikhs who were considered to look like Muslims. Yeah. So when, for example, you have a war against terrorism and Muslim cemeteries are desecrated, again, you don't... Why is this the case? Are you looking for terrorists in cemeteries? No. So obviously there's a connection that is made implicitly, which everyone understands, even though there's a war against terrorism.
Can we talk about your views, all your views, on the position of fundamentalism, if I can use that word, inside Islam, and to take what Jonathan said a stage further, because I think it's a very fair point. How is it regarded?
I have a problem with the word. It's a 19th century word that we use to describe reformist movements within Protestant Christianity. In Islam, fundamentalism, the word in Arabic is actually a very high word. It has to do with building based on sound fundamentals or principles. Extremism, however, is a word I think that is more useful. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, beware of extremism. The Quran actually says to the Christians and the Jews, do not go to extremes in your religion. So the Quran actually tells Jews and Christians not to go to extremes. So it becomes troublesome when there are Muslims who their own book tells other religions not to be extremists, when they begin to become extremists. So I think that extremism is the problem. It's a human problem. I think that it exists, it's a human tendency. Extreme circumstances breed extremism, as in Nazi Germany. But I think that in terms of the theology of it, there is a crisis crisis in Islam right now, which is how do we legitimize religious authority. This was not a problem 100 years ago because the institutions for legitimizing authority were still very much intact. They were literally dismantled by the colonial enterprise.
I think there's a political edge to this as well. I mean, one of the things happened in 1924, the Khalifa was abolished by Mustafa Kemal.
Can you just explain what that means?
The Khalifa was basically the authorized political leadership of the Muslim world, or it claimed to be that anyway, and it was more or less recognized. So there was a template for Muslims at what kind of political authority there should be, and that was to live under a Khalifa, and then you could worry about whether it was a good or a bad Khalifa, but that was more or less the template. Now with the abolition of that, you suddenly have an explosion of political theory. How should Muslims live? In what kind of political arrangements are necessary for Muslims? And that is what you're seeing is actually the politicization of those questions. And that's why I accept exactly what Hamza is saying about the theological influences, but there's also a political imperative that for Muslims, how to live, like any other society, how to live in a good society. What is the idea of a good society? When you no longer have a sanctified answer to that, you then start having attempts to try and construct this. This is why, for example, the movements, all of these movements that people call fundamentalists, what they really want is an Islamic order. Now, what that actually means in practice varies greatly from place to place. And why people actually, to some extent, follow them, because for them, Islamic order simply means a just order or good governance. Now, it's the practice of putting that there, putting it into place, which becomes very, very complicated.
This strikes me as very interesting because it seems to me there may be an answer here to my earlier question, because if one of the problems which both of you are describing in the Muslim world is an absence of an accepted authority system of a kind that I would understand in the Christian world, for example, then maybe the individuals you named are able to fire off these fatwas, but they're not universally accepted in the way that I would understand maybe applying a kind of more formal hierarchical model from some of the other of the world's great religions. But it seems to me this might be a wider problem for Islam, that it doesn't have there's a leadership vacuum, is in a way what you're describing.
No, this is a major problem. Another aspect that a lot of people aren't aware of is that traditionally in the Muslim world, the best intellects went to Islamic studies and theology just as in the West. Now, we still have quite significant training, theological training in the West here. I mean, we have some very serious Christian thinkers still. However, in the Muslim world, the vast majority of intellects now go to medicine, go to engineering, and these type of elements.
It is the result of that the kind of collective ostracism of terrorism, Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, that in a way, and I think a lot of people in the West are looking for, is actually impossible to ask for from the Muslim world.
Well, there's no such unity of the Muslim world. I mean, firstly, even if you had, I mean, why isn't there a Muslim unified speaker? You assume that if there was a Muslim leadership, it would be a leadership that actually would collaborate and would actually be able to cooperate.
Yeah. Is it just a crude analogy, like a papacy?
There's not only the papacy, there's the priesthood in Islam.
I think, yeah.
No, but even though there wasn't a priesthood...
Last time there was a de facto... Last time there was a de facto leadership, in a sense, was Ayatollah Khomeini. And the problem here was this, and he certainly had his supporters outside just the Shia circles. So the problem here comes down to it is this: is it possible to imagine a leadership of the Muslim world which will be recognized as a leadership of the Muslim world by non-Muslims, which can also be anti-Western, for example, can say, well, actually, we don't agree with the foreign policies and things like that. And these are the kind of complicating issues that you can't keep removing this question simply to instances of what the texts say or what happens in theology. These are actually political questions which are politically founded.
Well, I agree with that too, but I'm afraid it's one of the other things I've sort of picked up in just conversations I've had. The sense I'm getting is a lot of clerics or theologians or students of this would make a theological judgment similar to the one you made, which is that it's a gross distortion, etc., but feel frightened for political reasons of saying that, because they do not want to be on the wrong side of what is a growing trend, particularly among the young of the Arab and Muslim world, and they do not want to be less radical than the man who's now the current champion of this movement.
Okay, we'll be back in a couple of minutes. We haven't quite finished talking about the fundamentalist issue, so let's just spend a few more moments on that. Given the scholarship, the leadership in a theologically guided society have been, as it were, not wiped out, but almost wiped out over the last 100 years. Given that, do you think that that has allowed free rein to the fundamentalists and that they are now the driving force? There is, I'm sorry to be, nothing to stop them. They are taking over, and if that's right, what are they doing with this takeover?
I don't think they are the driving force, to be honest with you. I think Oliver Roy's book, The Failure of Political Islam, is an important book in that he was already seeing the decline of this. Unfortunately, this situation that we're in now is, in a sense, reviving this, which to me is tragic. I think that the vast majority of Muslims are a silent majority. They haven't stood up and been counted. But I really do feel that the majority of Muslims are as troubled and frightened as well by what's happening as Western people. I really believe that.
But it does seem to the West, and a lot is, you know, we all know that things exist on perception as well as reality. It does seem to people in the West, and maybe the media is distorting it, and so on and so on and so forth. Never mind, it does seem to us that when we see what is going on, it is the fundamentalists that we're seeing. That's a fundamentalist agenda. Now, is that completely wrong, Salman?
No, I think, again, I mean, this is one of the problems we have with language. I mean, like as I mentioned, fundamentalist has particular connotations about literalist readings and things like that. And of course, there's a variant in that. Most of the groups that we, for example, used to call fundamentalists, like look at the Iranian Revolution. Now, in many ways, what's happened in Iran since the revolution, you actually have a working election system. You have, until the last election, more women in Iranian parliament than you had in Britain. You have many kinds of things that people don't know about. Now, at the same time, you have something like Saudi Arabia, which is considered to be non-fundamentalist, even though it doesn't allow women to drive, and the difference between the Saudis and the Taliban in terms of their interpretation of Islam is very narrow. So the question, again, comes down to what we understand by fundamentalism, again, tends to become colored to whether it's a political agenda, whether it opposes a certain set of ideas and ideals. For example, why is it that Hezbollah has so much support in southern Lebanon? Because they carried out a war against occupation. You can't just dismiss these ideas and simply say, well, these people are wrong. Most of these people actually have an innovative reading of the Quran and the texts rather than just a literalist reading.
Well, before we go on to see what we can do about it, you made a point, William Dalrymple, I don't know if it was in your book or an article, but you certainly made it, that the talk about East-West is rather undermined by the fact that Christianity, and I would have thought Judaism too, could be described as Middle Eastern religions. So the three great world religions we're talking about, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I had a discussion yesterday with three people, each of us talking about Joseph, and it really was, one was a Jewish Englishman, one was a Muslim Englishman, and it was me, and they said, it's my Joseph, no, it's my Joseph, it's my Joseph.
It's all of our Joseph.
Yeah, but
that's that's the point, it is all of us.
Yeah. And what does that give us then? If we go in from that point of view, what does that do in terms of attempting this process of unifying?
I think it's very, very important to take in the fact that we're all converts to Middle Eastern religions. You were asking how much can you take Jesus to be God and how much is he man? And the endless variations. The Aryans believed one thing, the Nestorians believed another, and Islam's attitude to Christ was very, very similar to the Aryans and the Nestorians.
Hans Kuhn actually said that in some ways Islam is Semitic Christianity.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry to be the sort of negative voice here, the party pooper at this table, because that's usually used as the way in for a benign message of world unity. We're all children of Abraham, and the Prime Minister used it in his famous conference speech. I'm sure that's such a positive way in for this reason, which is there's no war more vicious than a civil war, and there's no people who argue and fight more viciously than members of their own family. And the idea that this is somehow we're all from a very narrow patch of the Middle East, which all these three religions are, actually to me seems a recipe for even more suffocating and tension and conflict. Actually, we need to have this, in a way, the distance, or the respect rather, that comes with some distance, to say, that's you and that's what you do, this is us, this is what we do, and we respect them, rather than sort of cramping up against each other in the way that being a sort of a fratricidal family.
Salman, what's your view?
I think I probably agree more with Jonathan in and around this matter. I think having similar roots doesn't actually make the problem less intense, the conflict. It actually makes the possibility of conflict more greater in many ways. I think what we need really is, I think we started with a point, is a movement away from where you have one kind of cultural formation which is used as a way of understanding everything else. And that is, I think, is really what's the issue here. That to understand that the Muslim experience quite often gets interpreted as when Europe looks into the mirror and sees its past. So we talk about all the kind of metaphors of medievalism, superstition, violence, all the dark ages, etc. And that comes from this kind of gaze.
If the sanctity of life is shared by secular humanists
and that has never stopped
and
warfare.
by all of the religious faith traditions. However, the people that perpetrate the crimes, like September 11th, have a blatant disregard for the sanctity of life. This is a human problem.
What about the other...
This is not a religious problem. It's not rooted in any individual religious group. I think what we're dealing with is an element of humanity, but it's an extremely small element. And the problem is we're allowing a very small group of people to suddenly dictate the world's agenda. And I think we have to recognize that.
I think what we have to recognize is that in terms of conflicts that we talk about, unless you want to go into this idea that it's all to do with individual psychologies and for human beings, that we just have a propensity to have war, which is one way of thinking about it, we have to recognize that having common values, having these agreements doesn't necessarily bring about notion of peace. Before you can talk about crimes, you have to have an agreement on what is law and what is just. And unfortunately, the level of world politics, that isn't that clear cut. So you can't just simply say this act constitutes a crime and the other one doesn't, without having some notion prior to that of the law.
On paper, it is very similar. I think in practice is where the problems emerge.
Well, no,
because I don't think Western concepts of justice are not dissimilar to Islamic concepts of justice.
It's not a question of concept of justice. It's a question of this. What actions do we consider to be illegitimate, and what reasons? Is it the case that what happens, again, this is the kind of very kind of trite notion, that who actually does the writing of history about what was just or unjust? And this, it seems to me, is a very important thing. We can't simply say that Hiroshima, for example, when the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima, innocent civilians were killed. It's an act of war. But we have American generals saying they did not want the bomb to be dropped exactly for the reasons because it would kill innocent people. But it is an act that we've managed to live with, in a sense that it's become. So it seems to me that we have to be very, very careful that we're dealing with political concepts which themselves are contested. And theology doesn't help us in that matter because it becomes subject to contestation.
I'm going to come back to practical matters in this last furlong of the program, as it were. To get out of this, there are practical measures that could be expedited. Now let's take the broad brush. Jonathan Friedland, do you think that America changing its foreign policy, giving up its demands on the terrorists, do you think that would change things? Do you think, there is a view that, look, American foreign policy is at least 50%, maybe more, to blame for this. Change the foreign policy, change the situation.
Yeah, this is the view, quoting Mao, that, you know, you can't catch the fish, but you can drain the sea in which they swim. And the sort of sea of grievances that enable or lead people to be recruited to Osama bin Laden's banner are really more or less the three demands he made. I mean, he didn't phrase them as demands, but an end of support for Israel in its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, although I think bin Laden would like to see Israel eradicated from the map altogether rather than just that. But let's say that. Second, American troops out of Saudi Arabia. And third, an end of the war on Iraq. Now, the interesting thing is all three of those actually have good arguments on their side anyway. The problem is they've now become bin Laden's shopping list, and I just don't see how the United States or actually anybody else in the so-called world community can be appearing to jump to his tune. I mean, the settlement that has taken 30 years in Northern Ireland may, in a way, reflect what was on the shopping list of the IRA 30 years ago. But the very fact that it was on their list meant it took 3 decades for it to happen, because otherwise you look as if you're giving in to terror. So I think there's a real problem there. The other thing I would just add very practically is something that can be done, is that people are in the so-called West are going to have to learn about Islam.
I'm looking for practical solutions now as we enter this thing. I mean, I'm looking, and that's ridiculous, but I think we should try to move towards that, right? If you said to Bush, look, if you 3 things you could do, if you could do anything you wanted and they would happen within a year, 6 months or so, these are the 3 things you should set off doing, what would they be?
I think that they would be so impractical as to waste my breath saying them, really? So I'm not going to. But what I would like to see...
That suggests a certain hopelessness.
Well, I don't want to be hopeless. I have 4 children, and like many people, I want a future for them. I don't want to see the world descend into a conflagration that, once it gets out of hand, we can't put out the flames. And in a sense, we are pulling a genie out of a bottle that might be very, very difficult to get back into, and I think we should all be deeply aware of that. If I did say anything, I would say that business as usual has to stop. I really believe that the politicians have to, the Christians would call it metanoia. They have to make a repentance. I think that they need to, in Greek it means change your mind. And I think that the Machiavellian approach to world politics is no longer viable after September 11th. So that's what I would say.
What are its practical manifestations?
The type of spin, the type of cynicism, the type of damage control, the type of wills in America called Palestine Palestine, he said, Palestine is not a problem because problems have solutions. Palestine is a mess, and messes are managed. I think that that type of approach, a cynical approach about human conditions that affect millions of people, is no longer acceptable. So I would say that there has to be a deep change, and I would hope that we reject Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. It's an unacceptable, untenable proposition.
Can I just drop in one thought about that, which is that often we focused, I think, on, I did in my answer to your question about what the West should do. Part of this process, and I think we're hearing it from the two Muslims around this table, is a process of introspection in the Arab and Muslim world. Partly there is a force to blame in the sense of American and other colonial powers who stopped those countries getting democratic open regimes and societies, but to wonder why it is that across that whole swathe of the world there aren't yet the democracies, the open societies, etc., that have been allowed to grapple with modernity. I think there's a large amount of blame on America for propping up these vile regimes, but there has to be some soul-searching on both sides of this process.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly.
For example, in Algeria, when the FIS won an election in '94, the military junta suspended the election. We did not have a major complaint about democracies. You don't have demands for democratization in Saudi Arabia being initiated by the United States. Now, for example, the complaints about the Taliban regime and its misogynist policies is coming out. But what similar policies have been operating in Saudi Arabia for many, many years, you could argue. Similarly, like a
but that is
example.
the kind of thing I'm talking about. People are not going to tolerate that much longer, I think.
But I think the problem really comes down to is this, that you ask why we don't have democracies in there. I think the question is, what does democracy actually mean? And I think perhaps one we should recognize that perhaps in many of the so-called third world, democracy may be a tainted currency because it has always been possible for some countries to enjoy democracy at the expense of others having to endure dictatorship. And perhaps that's some of the things that we need to get away from.
William Dalrymple.
Well, I think there's been a denial in the US that, you know, that Middle Easterners dropping bombs in America has anything to do with American Middle Eastern policy. And the thing which, you know, the wound certainly that seems to be felt most keenly across the Islamic world is continual and often ridiculous support by America for Israel. When you see America vetoing resolutions to send observers even, just observers, to see what's happening to the Palestinians, when America steps in and uses its power to veto something so completely controversial, when that happens over and over again, when they see it being funded, this is the wound which separates most widely. Which, I mean, the thing about the US troops in the Hejaz, that's a specifically Saudi grievance. I've never heard people in India complaining about that. But you do find Muslims in India complaining about Palestine. It is something that really means something to them, rightly or wrongly. It's something that really hurts.
Jonathan.
Well, I'm slightly doubtful about the Muslims across the whole of the Muslim world. I know that, for example, Kashmir is a hotter issue in India and in Pakistan than Palestine is. I also just think this is part of the problem because, of course, if you're Palestinian, and frankly, even if you're a Muslim, you care about the mistreatment of Palestinians. You should. But I think instead that often gets interpreted into this is the source of all our problems. We live under a military dictatorship here in Pakistan because of Palestine. We live in desperate unemployment in Morocco because of Palestine, and we're in, to use that cliche, the dark ages in Afghanistan somehow because of Palestine. This to me seems to be an absolute diversion,
why they dislike the US.
It doesn't hold up.
It doesn't hold up for all their problems, but it does hold up.
But dislike the US for propping up their own vile regimes, as well as disliking them for what they do with it.
Jonathan, one thing you're being slightly unfair about is that, again, the support for Palestine by the United States also means support for regimes that support Israel de facto, and that's one of the kind of arguments that goes around. So the reason why the Saudi royal family is allowed to get away with XYZ, or Mubarak is allowed to win an election with 97% without a comment that actually elections with 97% or something even New Labour can't manage, so there must be something going on here, without even a comment like that, suggests to me that Mubarak is essential to maintain a certain Israeli policy. The United States policy towards the Muslim world as it exists largely is concerned about its relationship with Israel.
See, again, I'm afraid that's just it's a delusion, because
it's
obviously it has an oil interest across the whole of this vast region. Well, you're right, the support for Israel is part of it, but it props up Saudi Arabia, not because of his support for Israel. Saudi Arabia is no supporter of Israel, I'll break that news to you. It's about oil. And of course America props up those regimes. That's bad enough. You don't need what I think of as this slight diversionary tactic, which I admit, I think William's right. It's huge in the Muslim world. I slightly question how wise it is for a world that, from everything we've have heard from Hamza and you, needs desperately some soul-searching and a process of change
I think
to just latch
we
onto
do
this
on
one
all
issue.
sides. I think the West, we need to become introspective in the West,
Of course.
and I think Muslims need to become introspective. I really think we all need to take a good look in the mirror, you know, as a global community.
Well, we have to end somewhere, and that's a good place to end. Thank you very much, Jonathan Friedland, Salman Saeed, William Dalrymple, and Hamza Yusuf.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Position.